Okay. Hi. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, friends, and guests. It's really my great pleasure to be here today with you in Prague. Some of you I've seen at the conferences, others we have known each other for longer, but it's really a pleasure to be here today and present some of my research, as Peter already mentioned in the introduction. It's based on my Marie Skłodowska Curie Fellowship that I'm carrying out at the moment. And today's talk will be divided into three parts. I'll start with slightly, as I'm sure that some of you may not know me, slightly showing you a little bit of my background and what I've done before this project and what has led to this X-Scheme project that I'm carrying out right now. Then show some of the questions that I'm posing in my research, and then finally bring up the case study that it's soon to be published that I will bring to the table today. And really what runs throughout my, working. What runs throughout my research is kind of trying to incorporate cross-cultural perspectives into Eastern Mediterranean prehistory, which for some of you here, like Peter, Václav, and others, it might not be so unusual, but it may be still somewhat unusual in Central European archaeology. So let's start a little bit about my background. And before starting really diving into the topic, I would just like to address a little bit the question of comparison that I'm trying to do as a trained sociocultural anthropologist to bring into conversation the archaeological context from Neolithic and early Bronze Age in Eastern Mediterranean with ethnographic cases from around the world from non-state societies. And the comparison that I like to draw, how I see the comparison between the archaeological and ethnographic data, I would take the inspiration from biology. And this is namely comparing those two cases is like comparing humans and dolphins. And even though they look very different from one another and they live in very different ecological environments, if we would have never compared them, we would have never learned that they are actually both mammals. And so as species, they really share an important trait of being able to, or giving birth and reproductive techniques, but even though they look very different. So, and that allows us to understand both differences and similarities between species. And for me, as a cultural anthropologist, comparing ethnography with archaeology would allow me to, on one hand, see the similarities that we could draw between different societies, but also the similarities that they might have. So now starting with how I have come into the question of like looking into the archaeology, or how I got into archaeology, was really during my PhD project, which I did at the University of Vienna. And at the time, the director of the Austrian Archaeological Institute, Barbara Horesh, was excavating the site of Çukurçy, which is the prehistoric site next to Ephesus, the ancient city of Ephesus, which was a multi-period site from Neolithic to the early Bronze Age. And there was another person working on early Bronze Age site of Platia Magula Zarko in northern Greece. And they were searching for a cultural anthropologist to join the team and actually bring the anthropological theory into the interpretations of social organization at the site, asking the questions of how inegalitarian or egalitarian the societies would have been in these cases, and whether we are really looking at chiefdoms, as the chiefdom social organization was like kind of the most agreed upon within the region during the early Bronze Age one. And in this project, I worked together with two archaeologists, Constanze Moser and Maria Röcklinger, who analyzed the pottery, and they made those results available to me. And zooarchaeologist Stephanie Emra, who is now a postdoc in Munich, who was analyzing zooarchaeological finds at Çukurçy. So we could compare them between different rooms because it was a settlement, and see whether people accumulated some sort of prestige meat pieces in one room or whether there was like distribution across the site. And myself as a cultural anthropologist bringing the anthropological points of view on social organization at the site. So our aim was really kind of bridge together the cultural anthropology, archaeology, and zooarchaeology. And as I mentioned, we compared these two sites. And without going further into any of the details, what I would like to highlight is that this was really an eye-opening for me. As a cultural anthropologist, never working with archaeologists before, what was important for me, and both of the sites were already excavated. So I didn't participate in the excavations, but what I did, I spent 3 months in Seljuk, where the Austrian Archaeological Institute has its depot for Ephesus and Çukurova excavations. And I joined there, my colleagues analyzing pottery. And I also documented 3,000 cockle shells from one of the pits at Çukurova by the length, width, height, and weight. So that was really an eye-opener of, it's not just excavation that like needs to be thoroughly done, but really documentation and entering those data into databases before the archaeologists can analyze them and really come up with any suitable interpretations. And based on that, like the rest of my PhD time, I spent as an armchair anthropologist working mostly in the office, trying to read the archaeological reports and trying to bind them with the so-called uncontrolled comparison, if one would want to refer to Marshall Sahlins, to compare the archaeological data with ethnographic contexts. And I would just highlight 2 publications that came out of my PhD project. This one is the first one called, it's a journal article titled "No Place Like Home for Metal Workers, Household-Based Production at Early Bronze Age, Çukurova and Beyond." And in this paper, what I did was I followed the archaeometallurgical analysis, which showed that like arsenical copper at Çukurova wasn't produced only in one metalworking workshop, but it seemed to be kind of very distributed across the site. And so it seemed to be taking place alongside other household activities, such as consumption of meat or food preparation, food consumption, textile work, and so on. And that was kind of a question that I thought about, okay, do we have other cases, maybe not of arsenical copper production, but of metalworking that it's also distributed across the site in households rather than in a centralized metalworking workshop? And that was the case where I collected a lot of information from ethnographic analysis, and through a qualitative comparison kind of showed that this can be a case also in ethnography, where it's not just centralized metalworking workshops for production of metals. And based on this, based on metalworking, but also other things, I proposed kind of a model of social organization in Western Anatolia at the time, because what Çukurova was not, seemingly didn't follow the same settlement organization as, for example, the earliest phases at Troy, which Maria Ivanova has described as the egalitarian society, where all the households are looking exactly as one another, or that at Polyochny, where Orania Kuka has based on the centralized workshop, and in which a lot of long distance goods accumulated in one workshop, called the seat of chief, and therefore interpreted the site as the chiefdom. Instead, at Çukurova, we seem to have rather a hierarchical social organization, where households would be sharing with one another, but also competing with one another, which in cultural anthropology, I have drawn the analogy to the great man societies as known in the Pacific. And also really inspired from the Pacific was the case that like in the Pacific, you could have chiefdoms on Trobriand Islands, but also great men societies and big men societies in Melanesia. So it really kind of inspired me to think about regional variability in social organization, even though maybe sites have shared the material culture at the site, let's say in early Bronze Age. But nevertheless, there could be variability in terms of social political organization. And I published that in the book with Austrian Academy of Sciences Press, titled Çukurova for Household Economics in the Early Bronze Age, Aegean. And even though the title is misleading, it has only Çukurova in the title, but there is also a part on Platia Magura Zarko on early Bronze Age 1 layers, which I contextualize within the regional framework. Now, during my PhD studies, I really came to archaeology as a person who was interested in household archaeology, because that's what my colleagues were doing, namely being interested in households, social organization, social inequality. And I soon understood that maybe in many cases, households were kind of used as an umbrella term for what cultural anthropologists might also call family or domestic unit or kinship-based social organization. But during that time, while I was writing my PhD, all these papers came out with questions such as, were Europe's megalithic societies patrilineal? Or the female ancestors stay long-term matrilineal continuity, or the kinship-based social inequality in the Bronze Age Europe. So that was kind of, for me, the first time like trying to dwell into archaeological literature, that all of a sudden kinship came back into, or maybe just appeared in archaeological vocabulary, but really reinstated by these strong archaeogenetic papers that based on ancient DNA would either support matrilineal community once people buried together would be genetically related through the female line, or patrilineal community once the pedigree would show relatedness through the males. And I thought, oh, if that was so easy, then what were anthropologists doing for a year or longer in the field, trying to study those communities like really close and try to understand the social organization in non-state societies elsewhere. And that was kind of like the main drive for me to start to developing the project that I wish to work on, which is now the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowship, on which I am working currently. And in this project, which I would just like to show you some of the questions that I'm posing, is inspired by the 150 years of research on kinship in sociocultural anthropology. And just to quote Robin Fox from 1976, he wrote, "Kinship is anthropology what logic is to philosophy or nude is to art. It is the basic discipline of the subject." And even though maybe many cultural anthropologists today would not agree with it any longer, because that was 50 years ago, anthropology really was founded based on kinship studies and looking at kinship through a cross-cultural perspectives to come up with maybe 6 main systems of descent that kind of repeat each other like cross-culturally, and through comparison trying to understand how societies are basically organized. But nevertheless, what is kinship research in cultural anthropology has gone through huge transformation as well, especially because of this book published by David Schneider in 1987, a critique of the study of kinship. And David Schneider was at the time professor at the University of Chicago, who really wrote, even though before that, he published a book, Matrilineal Kinship, for example, and he was a big proponent of thinking about it cross-culturally. In this book, David Schneider says, we should just abandon kinship studies because all of those studies put a Western-centric lens of kinship meaning biological relatedness between individuals. And we cannot understand it that way because communities organize themselves in many different ways, and blood can be only one subject or substance of relatedness, but there are many other ways that one could become related. So we should just move away from kinship and kind of dissolve the subfield altogether. Well, David Schneider wasn't successful because in, let's say, the feminist approaches with really Janet Karsten leading this path in the UK, especially in social anthropology, in her book, After Kinship, she really argued for studying relatedness rather than kinship, which means thinking about what brings people together and what makes them being kin. And that could be, as she showed through many examples, it could be sharing of the food, co-residence, commensality, but also many other ways of kin making, such as adoption or milk kinship, as like not blood, but then milk being the substance for making kin. In other societies, that would be bone or flesh, and so on, which was also then put forward by or advanced by Maurice Godelier in his cross-culture or like really comparative study on a global scale. And today, more and more indigenous scholars are being interested in writing about kinship, including this one, Becoming Kin by Patty Kravitz, to understand the indigenous ways of making kin and how do indigenous people themselves describe it to be related. So even though Robin Fox in 1976 would really say it was the founding or the most important topic of this discipline, maybe kinship isn't that any longer in cultural anthropology, but there are still some people who are interested in kinship, including one of your colleagues here visiting us today from Brno. And this is Lenka sitting here in the room, and she's a cultural anthropologist who worked with matrilineal communities in South India. And she has reached out to me, and yeah, thanks for being here with us. I'm glad that there is some interest in this kind of conversations in Czech Republic as well. So in my current project, I look at two questions. And the first one is, how can the material remains, such as settlements, buildings, artifacts, and biological markers, be read as material codes of prehistoric kinship? And the second question is, how can ethnographic reports exemplify rather than verify variability in kinship during prehistory? And here the emphasis is really on the exemplification, as I would rather do it from qualitative comparison to show that there can be different means of organizing ourselves. And I'm not interested in, so what I would take is like from ancient DNA, where you want to verify that people are related by blood through certain means, to really question what does it tell us. But also not only when people are related, but also when people are not related. And when you cannot kind of overcome anymore because now in archaeogenetics, you can even infer the relatedness up to the 10th degree by identity, by descent methods. So the questions when we know that people are not related, so why would they still be buried together? In this project, I look at 4 research sites in southeastern Europe and Anatolia, dating to Neolithic and early Bronze Age, namely Vucedol, Lepenski Vir, Çatalhöyük, and Alfantepe. And today in my case study, and so if you think, how did I choose these sites? They don't share any archaeological culture. They are not, well, some of them might be contemporary to each other. It's really what joins them all together is that they all have residential burials. And as someone who has come from household archaeology into archaeology, I'm always interested in how can then a house as a unit of analysis be overlapped with people buried within those houses. Because for a long time, people would have assumed that there should be families or people buried within this same house should be biologically related in one way or another, which has been postulated for Çatalhöyük, but also other sites. Now, how I approach these questions in my project is I use the kinship-based approaches in archaeology, such as publish ancient DNA results, stable isotopes, settlement patterns, and household archaeology. I then use a qualitative or controlled comparison, or what Alison Wiley would call the simple analogy between archaeological and ethnographic examples. And finally, once all these sites are analyzed, I will put them into a regional comparison to think about both synchronic and diachronic one to see whether we can think about changes in kinship and how does it change over time from Neolithic to the early Bronze Age. And I have published some of those questions in the article in Anthropology Today, titled Why Kinship Still Needs Anthropology in the 21st Century, where I really try to argue that what has been described, for example, as patrilineal descent in archaeogenetics, or what the geneticists would call patrilineal descent, in cultural anthropology can mean something else rather than genetic relatedness to people, but it's really an imaginary and social setting of how people reckon their ancestors. And this is something that is kind of a long-standing binary divide between thinking about kinship as biological or thinking about kinship as social, but it really is both. We are born into communities, but then how we become part of those communities really depends on how the community is organized or what kind of choices we might make during our life course. So in this article, I ask a simple question, which I would like to share with you today as well. And it is, if I have money and a bag, and I put my money into the bag. To whom does it belong? To me or to the bag? What do you think? So who thinks the money belongs to me? Okay. And who thinks the money belongs to the bag? No one? Okay, great. So this is just a question like to stimulate us to think about it, a question that wasn't posed by me or an analogy that wasn't posed by me, but it really comes from Audrey Richards, a Cambridge-based anthropologist who was documenting Bemba community in Africa. And she quotes, "If I have a bag and put money into it, the money belongs to me and not to the bag. But the Bemba say, a man put semen into a woman, and yet the choice belongs to her and not to him." And why is this so? Is because Bemba were a matrilineal community in which women really, the descent was traced through the women's side. And the father, the biological father, was really kind of a, you know, a semen donor in that sense, but not a social figure. Like, so it wasn't the social figure who would be crucial in upbringing of those children, because who was really crucial part in this society was like the mother's brother. So the child's uncle in that sense, in our perspective. And this is one of those cases that makes kind of then archaeogenetic interpretations very complicated, because if you have, even though these people will be buried together, of course we can put them on genetic pedigrees, but these people would not live necessarily in such households as according to the genetic pedigree, because it would be uncle who makes the most important decisions about what is it important to learn, when do we go to hunt, when do kids need to learn to do certain things. Okay. Something happened here. Yeah. Oh, okay, that's fine. It's back now, I think. No. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay. Oh. Or shall we put it there? Oh, okay. Okay.
Jo, takže toto je za zkratku.
Okay, so it's fine? Oh, okay. Okay, good. No problem. Okay, so we're back to matrilineality, okay? So one of the questions that I was interested after like thinking about Bimba was kind of also a regional diversity of between matrilineal societies. And in the ethnographic atlas, where 1,265 societies would be documented, only 13% of those matrilineal of those societies are matrilineal. And somehow they do class, I mean, they can be randomly spread, but in some way they do cluster in Pacific Northwest, in American Southwest, in what anthropologists would call the African matrilineal belt, and in the Pacific, a lot of them on those Pacific islands. And versus, and what I was interested in to think about when we call something matrilineal, what do we really call matrilineal? And like, is there any regional diversity, how these societies are organized? So to just show you that, as I'm sure that as archaeologists, you're not thinking every day about that, is that societies, I chose two communities to compare. The first one being Hopi from the American Southwest, and the other one being the Trobrians from the Pacific. So two communities that seem to be kind of independent of each other. Both of them were really well documented and well studied by a number of anthropologists who would learn the local language and study them closely for years. And even though these two communities, the Hopi and the Trobriand islands, follow a matrilineal descent, among the Hopi, the residence is matrilocal, meaning after the marriage, the couple moves in with the mother's or like wife's family. And among the Trobrianders, it's a voluncal marriage, so they would marry into wife's brothers. So kind of like if you would think about two uncles' side of maternal uncle's side after marriage. So it's already a difference in residence pattern, even though you still have the same matrilineal descent. And versus women own storage and houses among the Hopi, it's men, or namely the mother's brother that I've been talking about several times now, or the uncle who owns the houses and storage. It is women who make really most important decisions within houses among the Hopi, as Hopi would be a classical example of matrifocal societies where women are heading the households and they are deciding what children need to learn and how we are bringing them, versus its men or the mother's brother, so the called uncle, who makes the decisions, most important decisions within the houses among the Trobrianders. Among the Hopi, the highest political office would be Council of Elders, because they would follow a pattern where with certain age, you have the ability to kind of raise in status, and you can become a member of this Council of Elders, which is open for both men and women. Versus in Trobrianders, it's the highest political office would be the seat of chief. And even though it's matrilineal society, the chiefs would be male, but they would be followed or selected through the matrilineal logic. And finally, the decisions within the public domain, such as are we going to war, with whom are we going to exchange goods and trade, are done by the Council of Elders among the Hopi. It's really the chief who makes those decisions for the community among the Trobrianders. And finally, while the Hopi are kind of a classic example of the so-called decentralized matrilineal community, the Trobrianders would be an anthropological classic example for the chiefdom or the centralized social-political constellation. Now, why is this important is just to bring some points home of why I will not go for the same case for patrilineality, but it's just to show that matrilineal descent can be one thing, but actually a lot of things together. And that societies with matrilineal descent not necessarily share the same residence pattern. That women do not necessarily own houses, storage, or land. The women are not necessarily the heads of households. The women do not necessarily hold the highest political office, as we have seen from the Trobriand's male chief. And the communities with matrilineal descent can be both centralized and decentralized social political systems. And I have published about that in a very recent article titled Enthroned, Dethroned, Rethroned, The Multiple Lives of Matrilineal Kinship in Aegean Prehistory, in which I tried the aim of this article was that was one of the first projects after my PhD, was kind of to revisit how people have supported matrilineality in Aegean prehistory without ancient DNA and without stable isotopes, based on the house of sizes, settlement organization, the figurines, the settlement, the subsistence practices, and so on. And it's quite an interesting piece because I not only try to show the variability of matrilineal kinship, but also the article has been open for a discussion with 3 commentaries from 2 archaeologists and 1 cultural anthropologist, which with my reply, and you will see that some archaeologists just would not want to see any cultural anthropology in European prehistory, which might not be so surprising, but yeah, welcome to dwell into it if you are interested to read more. why I'm showing this is like really to elevate that matrilineality is back on the archaeological or genetic agenda, is that now matrilocality or matrilineality has been inferred from genetic perspectives in Iron Age Britain, but also people talk about female lineages and kinship patterns in Neolithic Çatalhöyük, as well as the matrilineal community in Neolithic China. So all of these studies are really recent and published in high-ranking journals. But at the end, I try to show matrilineality as the word itself tells us really little about the community, because those communities can be organized in so many different ways. Now, what I would like to point out before we move to the case studies is that during my XKIM project, the biggest advantage, or yeah, sometimes projects don't go as you plan, but this was really beautiful opportunity for me to see how the sausage is being made. Namely, I participated for 2 weeks in Ankara at the Middle Eastern Technical University in a lab led by Mehmet Sumel here, and with excavator Ian Hodder and their team to discuss the final outcomes of Çatalhöyük, and which then resulted in science paper. I'm not part of the science paper because I was not part of like the research team in the long term, but nevertheless, that was a wonderful opportunity to see how you come from discussion and to the interpretation, but also how geneticists really try to work out with archaeologists very closely to come to their interpretations. And during this time that I spent in Ankara, okay, yeah, and my part is now trying to bring cultural anthropology into the paper that I have currently under review. But nevertheless, during this time that I spent in Ankara, so I could be talking about Çatalhöyük today, but I won't, because I'm sure Ian Kite also was here in September and told you about the population dynamics at the site. I selected another case study that kind of was the outcome of my time spent in Ankara, where I developed collaboration. I also visited, of course, southeastern Europe and Lipenskvivir, namely with Sofia Stefanovic, who is a bioarchaeologist of Lipenskvivir based in Belgrade, Yilmaz Selim Erdal, who is a biological anthropologist based in Ankara, Rana Özbal and Foke Gerritsen, who are the excavators of Barcınhöyük. This is a Neolithic site in Marmara region in Turkey. And Melis Kuruyucu and Ayca Aydogan, who are geneticists and biological anthropologists in Ankara. And what really allowed us, not only during my 2 weeks research stay there, was really the Zoom that kind of connected us all to be able to pull this study together, because it's a comparative study between a site in southeastern Europe and a site in Anatolia, which is the aim of my project. So what I'm gonna show you now, it's really something that is like in proof stage for publication. For World Archaeology, an article titled "Cradled by Architecture: Infancy and Delayed Personhood in Neolithic Anatolia and the Balkans." So in this comparative case study, we are interested we kind of started thinking about how can we think about infancy and infant burials in a cross-cultural perspective. And we will be looking at 2 burials associated with archaeological structures at Barcınhöyük, dating to 6,600 to 6,250 BC, and Lipenskvivir, dating to 6,200 to 6,000 BC, namely to that phase of Lipenskvivir that has trapezoid structures, which I will show in a moment. And our study was driven by thinking about if we compare those sites, how can we think about differences, exceptions, and similarities in burial practices? And finally, with an aim to maybe potentially see some shared practices in Central Balkans and Anatolia during the early Neolithic period. So, as I said, our study was kind of driven with this predisposition that infants, or in a cross-cultural perspectives, that infants or children up to a certain age are considered not fully human, as they are considered to have a delayed personhood. So similar to one is like becoming kin, you can become kin at birth, but with thinking about the person, you are not fully human until in some societies they have different roles, until you cannot chew or like swallow whole normal food or walk, or in some communities like even hunt or whatever would be expected for a person to become a full integrated person into the community. And it has been also very much discussed in archaeology that children and infants are often not afforded the same burials as adults. So there seemed to be a kind of a division of how they would be disposed after that. And it was cultural anthropologists such as Maurice Godelier, but then also me and Christoph Schwalk, who looked in some of the ethnographic details, that infants could be associated with the spirit world. So if I said not fully human, it's kind of being from another world, coming to this world, and then trying to be part of this world, but really for some time, while they are not integrated, being in the spirit world. And I have borrowed this term, ghost children, from Robert Rattray, who studied the Anshanti. And he described these pod children or infants being buried in middens as kind of ghost children that don't belong into family cemeteries, being buried next to the adults, but really being disposed in different ways for exactly the reasons, because they are not fully human. And other cultural anthropologists have also kind of associated the house and the womb as kind of the making of the kid or the making of the house and being part of the community. So before we delve into the comparison between the sites, let me just briefly talk about the scales of comparison for those early Neolithic burial practices between the Central Balkans and Western Anatolia. So the sub-region in which those sites are located are in Danube Gorge or the Eastern Marmara for Lipenski Vir and Bargin-Huyuk. I already mentioned that those sites are almost contemporary, not necessarily completely contemporary, but almost. And the units of analysis that we chose to follow in analyzing those burials, infant burials, were age, sex, burial location, and biological relatedness. Because the advantage was that for both sites, for Bargin, which is still unpublished, but we already were able to understand the data, and the Lipenski Vir, there is a data available that we could use to see whether those infants are genetically related to one another. To really think about this, what I already shared, to identify the unshared patterns and practices between sites and regions during the early Neolithic. Now, these are the location of Lipenski Vir and Bargin-Huyuk. As you can see, in very different ecological settings, Lipenski Vir being located in Danube gorges, in what is known for being really fish-rich area, where people were rather sedentary but not farmers yet. And Bargin-Huyuk on those Marmara plains, quite different setting from what we could see in Danube gorges. And before we compare them, we really thought about the differences, because that was something that always came from the archaeologists themselves as well, of why do we just compare a hunter-gatherer site, let's say, which would be the Lipenski Vir, to a really early Neolithic with animals and animal herding and domesticated plants and everything to one another. And why is that even important? So I do want to point out some of those differences. The first one being in the chronology. As I said, they are kind of contemporary, but not really, because Lipenski Vir is slightly older. Bargin-Huyuk is older than Lipenski Vir. And then in terms of settlement patterns, at Lipenski Vir, we have these trapezoid structures, which many of you are familiar with, versus at Bargin-Huyuk, there are those rectangular structures in the settlement. The building size at Lipenski Vir is kind of, the houses are similar to each other in size at least, versus structures really vary at Bargin-Huyuk from 9 to 30 square meters. The hearts are found within structures at Lipenski Vir, versus Bargin-Huyuk has really the hearts only structure within open spaces. And as I already said, the most obvious probably difference that many archaeologists are aware of is that Lipenski Vir is kind of a semi-sedentary fishing community without any domesticates, without domestic plants. and versus the Bargenhuyuk is like a farming community with fully developed, if you want to say it, Neolithic package. Yeah. And what turned out to, what I can show you here is that Bargenhuyuk has those wood and mud structures in which infant burials were often placed very close to the walls, as you can see here on this picture. And so I can just mention that, like, whereas for Lipinski Vir, the infant burials were already analyzed by Sofia Stefanovic and age at that determination was done. That was for the first time conducted for Bargenhuyuk by Yilmaz Erdal. And now let us look at the Bargenhuyuk, which is the Anatolian side. And in this, the earliest phase at Bargenhuyuk, 6E, dating from 6,600 to 6,500 BC, there are infant burials of both male and female sex chromosome associated with walls, and which we can see here, and one adult which is buried further south in an open space. And at Bargenhuyuk, we have so we have several phases that are one on top of another. As you can see, the settlement pattern kind of develops. And in this phase, we have infant burials, again, of male and female sex chromosome, again associated with walls, and no adults buried within house walls or so close to the architectural structures. So all of these infants are placed really close to the walls and close to the structures. And again, adults are pushed outside, it seemingly, or adults are really absent from those houses to be buried there. And finally, in the latest phase of Bargenhuyuk, which was analyzed for this study, with dating to 6D3 and 6C1, phase dating to 6,350 to 6,250 BC, we have again male and female genetically infants that are associated with walls and with an indoor space, which you can see here and here, really clustering around the walls, versus adults are in blue and open in, and some children which are in green, and like all the adults are again in the open spaces. And you can see that if you look at those adults, even like this really isn't a nuclear family kind of setting. So that's kind of obvious already, just without any genetic data, because you have those infants that cluster based on age here, and children that can be placed away from the walls, but somewhere in open spaces, and adults that really just are being pushed outside the houses and buried in open space. And that was an opportunity, as I said, this is that we can compare now to Lipinski Vir, which was already studied by Sofia Stefanovic. And this is the picture of the site, dating from 6,200 to 6,000 BC. And typical for that are those trapezoid structures with which people would agree or disagree to be a house or not a house, or a place for giving birth, or simply a shelter. And typical for those is kind of the red plastered floors. Now, infant burials at Lipinski Vir there were 19 of them found within and associated with walls by cutting through floors, at the rear of the 18 houses. So again, we have those 18 houses, and those infants are either associated with the walls or some kind of sturdy architectural features. And during this phase, again, no adults are buried within the houses, but they're buried in open space outside architectural structures. And I will zoom now into the house 24, or the structure 24, where you can see the settlement plan, and then the infant burials that are buried within it. So 4 of them, 1 with XY and 3 with XX sex chromosomes. And all of them are associated with the walls or the stones constructions at the rear end of the house 24. And here is the zoomed in to the individual 101 that you can see here, really like placed right next to the wall intentionally. So that makes us think about what are okay, so what I can say, that when we got this analysis back of age and death, the excavators themselves were really surprised, because they didn't expect that we would just find the infants next to the walls, because that was, they were really surprised, even though that was known for Lepenskivir. So our analysis was not based on like, oh, let us find all these similarities together, but that was kind of like a posteriori, like later out that it turned out to be the case. So when we thought about what are the similarities between the sites, we tried to think about what matters at placement at that and what doesn't matter, like based on these two examples. And it seems that age at that really mattered at both sites, since infants and adults were spatially separated instead of being buried together. The burial locations definitely matter, because infants were buried next to floor walls and adults were buried in open spaces or away from the settlement. So it's age and burial location that were at the center of kind of what we could see mattered a lot. But at the same time, sex does not seem to matter of those infants, because they were individuals of different sexes and they were buried together in the same way. So no matter whether they were genetically boys or girls, there was still no pattern into being able to distinguish them based on sex. And regarding biological relatedness, it did not seem to matter either, because individuals buried close by are not necessarily biologically related. So all these infants, even though there was genetic analysis done, they don't seem to form either relate as infant or as like siblings or cousins, or so they are simply not related but placed very close to each other. So the sex and biological relatedness seem to be way less important for the placement of those children. And if we want to think about it like kinship from an anthropological perspective, I can just say that Marshall Salins would put together that kinship is a mutuality of being, and therefore is like made through the life. But at the same time, kinship can be also done at death. So this is in a way that I would say like there is a way of making kin once you place somebody somewhere. Just for example, to give you an example, what I mean by that is like, who of you is currently living with the community into which you were born into? One. Okay. And after that, who of you will be likely buried or deposited in the community into which you were born into? Yeah, you didn't think about it. That's okay. But so it's really kind of thinking about this kind of kin work or so that like you can be born into, and then you reshuffle your life during the life course. And then at that, there will be kin probably networks which will really play an important role. And you might be placed where you were born into or really away from your place. So based on that, on just this question and like the comparison that I showed you here, I would like to draw several conclusions that we kind of put forward in this article. Is that, yes, despite all the differences that I wanted to outline at the beginning, we have a hunter fishing sedentary community at Lepenskivir versus early farmers in Anatolia. People at Lepenskivir and Barjinhuyuk bury their dead in similar ways. And I know that I'm talking to archaeologists, so people will say, oh, of course, this is so because out of Anatolia thing is real, and people brought this burial practice together with them out of Anatolia into the Balkans, because genetically we know they are coming from the Balkans. But just to give you an example, this burial of association with infants with the settlements exists already in Mesolithic in the Balkans. We don't know for Anatolia, but we know that in sites like Dusan Boric described for Vlasat, that was already an established practice in Mesolithic, so predating Neolithic practice in the Balkans. So if one would want to explain it, it's just, oh, it's this diffusionist expression of like what happens in the Neolithic and then just follows. It's really not the case. Even though we know that at Lepenskivir, there were already mixed origins of Anatolian and the Balkan origin at the time. And infants' burials were closely associated in both cases with architectural features or structures. And for burial location, the age and burial location really mattered, but sex and biological relatedness really did not seem to matter at all. And even though as a cultural anthropologist, as you know, I try to, my initial step into coming to this project was like, oh, we're going to be talking about matrilineality and patrilineality, and it's going to be exciting. This is kind of disappointing, right? Because based on this kind of data, when people are not related, you really cannot say whether they are matrilineal or patrilineal or what is like the kinship pattern. But it does really have implications of what also genetic relatedness tells us once they are not related to each other. And as I said already during the talk, the nuclear family was not the determining factor for the burial location, for which, as I said, you wouldn't have to even provide genetic analysis because you can see it already by the age determination, that the nuclear family, as we would know it, the father, son, and kids, or the partners with their children being buried together, was not the case. And that kin making extended to incomplete persons who were cradled by architecture after that. So this is kind of that I draw the loop to the title of our paper, namely cradled by architecture, and our aim of thinking about these children, not necessarily as full members of the community, but thinking about them as kind of ghost children, or not maybe being fully integrated into the community yet, and therefore not buried next to the other adults that were buried in open courtyards, but really thinking about still the house and the settlement as being this important part for kin making, and integrating this incomplete persons in some way. And finally, which is, I will not go much into details here, but it really seems that maybe belonging through age sets rather than biological relatedness is showing that kinship was continually made across the life course. I didn't go deep into the age sets, but it's kind of a very important concept in cultural anthropology, where especially in communities that may be more egalitarian, people are belonging to the age sets and then they move, or like I told you about the case of Hopi, where you would move through certain age sets and at some point you can be a member of the Council of Elders or something like that. And at the beginning, you go together through initiations and things like that at a certain age. So with this, I would like to wrap up the case study. And I'm inviting you to have a look at this published paper, which is right now really at proof stage in world archaeology. And for the very last part of my talk, I will just show you what I have been doing during the 2 years of my project. And one of my main aims was, as even this is a team-based paper, which is really not common in cultural anthropologists because cultural anthropologists are individual thinkers, as I was trained. What I tried to do during my project is really trying to bring cultural anthropologists, archaeologists, and geneticists to the same panels, to the same conferences, and try to create a dialogue to kind of how can we move the discipline forward. On the topic of kinship, as I said, like there is this tension between biological and social aspects of it, and how can we maybe dissolve it or move forward. So this is a panel from AAA, American Anthropological Association in Toronto in 2023, and AIA, American Institute of Archaeology in Chicago in 2024, which will result in soon to be published the special section in Cambridge Archaeological Journal titled Kinship Trouble, Traversing Interdisciplinary Boundaries Between Archaeology, Archaeogenetics, and Socio-Cultural Anthropology, which I'm co-editing with a geneticist at the University of Chicago, Mansa Raghavan, and the archaeologist from the University of York, which most of you may know, Penny Bickle. And I will also, that's planned for 2026, we have received the funding for hosting a 5-day seminar, hosting archaeologists, cultural anthropologists, and geneticists again on the topic of reimagining descent, apropos archaeogenetics, new interdisciplinary perspectives at the School for Advanced Research in New Mexico in Santa Fe, from which there will be another volume published on the topic. And this will be organized by myself and Peter Whiteley from the American Museum of Natural History. And finally, this will be really two of my light slides. So this is the picture that I want to show from a 2-day workshop in Vienna that Václav Hrnčíř were also participating in, where we brought again cultural anthropologists, archaeologists, and social cultural anthropologists to think about beyond genetics exploring aspects of non-biological kinship in prehistoric times, which was recently published in Anthropology Today, and of which Václav is also one of the co-authors. And so this was some of the outcomes that have come out of this project so far. But what I really want to highlight from this exact workshop in Vienna is we asked the participants to reflect on what are your takeaways from the Beyond Genetic workshops. And people would say, more synthesis is needed. We need mixing social and biological anthropology. Change in subsistence practice does not necessarily relate to change in kinship practice. But my favorite here is this one. And that's nice people. And I think that this is like one of the biggest successes when you can say that, like, people say that about each other at a workshop, because I feel like when even though we are not in the same research teams and we are usually not going to the same conferences, once you bring these people together and we can say, oh, you can still talk to a geneticist, even though maybe cultural anthropologists or many of them would consider genetics as a racist science, are able to communicate and having a respectful and constructive dialogue. I think that's a real success. And yeah, that happens once you not only discuss in the room, but also maybe have some drinks. So yeah, this is my message for today. I really feel that in the world that we live in today, that is so divided politically, we also need many more synergies and try to bridge the natural sciences with social sciences to move our disciplines forward, and not necessarily keep on waging wars when we disagree on some fundamentals in research. So thank you so much for, okay, that's my last slide. Sorry. I would really like to highlight that I've been really pleased to be working with Bill Parkinson at the Field Museum of Natural History, where I don't have to explain what I'm doing, but I'm really having like an open door for my ideas. And in his office, he's got this wonderful reminder that he is the #1 daddy, but he's really just a #1 mentor, I would say. So thanks to Bill, and really thanks to many other of my mentors that I had the privilege to be working with. And thanks a lot for you today in the room to take your time for listening to me, and everybody in the virtual space as well. I'm very much looking forward to any of your questions. Thank you.